It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Krusen, who is the inaugural program director for the entry-level clinical doctorate in occupational therapy here in UNMC in our college. Her research interests center around scholarship of teaching and learning, the occupational adaptation theoretical frame of reference, and research methods and methodology. She and her research partner collaborate in exploring the relative mastery scale as an effective, theoretically founded assessment of effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction to self and others. Dr. Krusen also enjoys practicing occupational adaptation on a personal level, seeking a dynamic balance in a busy life filled with human connection. And I love her statement about practicing occupational adaptation to have a dynamic balance in her life. So I'm sure you're as excited as I am to hear Dr. Krusen today, and I will pass the baton to her.
Dr. Bielik, thank you. And thank you, kind colleagues, for spending your lunch hour with me. I understand if you are muted so that you can munch your lunch. I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow along. And the session is being recorded for people and colleagues who are not able to participate with us today. Let's see, let me arrange myself here. There we go. Screen look good? Laura, thumbs up? Leah, thumbs up. Got it. Thank you. All right, let me arrange you where I can see you. Okay. Excellent. All righty. We are ready to roll. Make my cursor go over here so I can change our screen. All right. So the conversation today is to tell you a bit about this psychometric evaluation of the relative mastery scale. And some of you were able to hear me talk about this topic when I first interviewed for this position 3 years ago. It's been a while ago now. So a little bit of background about occupational adaptation. There we go. Occupational adaptation as a theoretical frame of reference was developed in the early 90s by a couple of colleagues. And you see Sally Schultz in the bright blue here, and Jeanette Scotty, who's in the khaki. I'm channeling my inner Dr. Scotty with my own khaki today. And they were two faculty members at Texas Women's University who were the spearhead, the forerunners to design this theoretical frame of reference of occupational adaptation. And it was intended for use at Texas Women's University for a PhD in occupational therapy, focusing on occupational adaptation. The woman who you see in the center is Lori George Pascal, and she is the first author on the article that was just published. It's in preprint right now, and she is one of my research partners. About 20 years ago, Dr. George Pascal developed the original relative mastery measurement scale, the RMMS, intended to measure relative mastery. And it was published, but it just languished. It didn't go anywhere. No one used it for anything, and nothing happened with it. So about 10 years ago, she and I looked at each other and said, this just won't do. We need to take up this instrument again and modify it. We need to look at the data from the inaugural study for the RMMS and just revise and come up with a new instrument, which is what we did. So we've been working on this instrument for the last 10 years and are so excited to finally have it in publication. And it actually is currently being used. So after I tell you about this psychometric study, I have a little bit of information at the end to tell you about how it is currently being used and how it could be used in practice, in education, and in research going forward. There we go. So you say relative what? What's relative mastery? It is an instrument that is intended to measure an individual's perception of their sense of effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. And we know that measures of perception can sometimes be biased, and they're difficult to assess. How do you put a number on that? So that's what we intended to do with this instrument. I'm going to pause just a moment because my Slides are skipping, which they're not supposed to do. Hold on just a moment. There we go. That's the one I want. I want to tell you a little bit about this theoretical frame of reference and its application as a model of practice, about the idea of adaptation. And we each adapt to daily life challenges on an ongoing basis every day. They may be small challenges, I've lost my keys, or a little bit bigger challenge, I have a flat tire, or even a greater challenge. My hometown is on fire and I need to evacuate, or larger yet, I have a family member who's had a stroke or has a significant injury or illness. And the way in which we respond to those challenges is measurable. And that's how we decided to develop this instrument for relative mastery. And if my slides won't skip, and there we go. All right, now we're in good shape. This is what the instrument measures. Relative mastery is not the same as skill mastery. Skill mastery means that you've gotten 100 on that exam and you did just exactly what you were supposed to do. The relative mastery is a little bit different. Suppose you wanted to invite people for dinner and you were preparing a unique dessert that you were very excited in creating, except that you were late from work. When you got home, you didn't have all the ingredients. You hadn't had time to shower. So you prepared something alternative and you shoved it in the oven. You ran away to wash your face, comb your hair, put a clean shirt on. You came back and it was burned. So you take it out of the oven and you thought, this is not what I had in mind. You grab the bread knife, you cut the top half of it off, and then you put a toffee sauce on the thing and you serve it for dinner and your guests are just thrilled. They think it's wonderful. Now you go back and you analyze through a relative mastery scale like this. How did you do? I might rate myself fair, not so great. I managed to serve people something, but it's not what I had in mind. How well did you use your helper material? Maybe again, not so well. I didn't have the materials that I wanted. So maybe a -2, maybe a -1. How satisfied are you? Well, a neutral. I fed them a dessert. Again, not what I had in mind. How much time and energy did you spend? I wasted some because I didn't get to the grocery store and I didn't get to shower. And if I had been more planful with my time and my scheduling, it would have turned out a little bit better. So I wasted some time. Did you achieve your goal? Again, maybe a 0. It's not the dessert I had in mind, but I was able to present something at the table. So maybe a 0. Did you achieve your goal? How satisfied would others be? They were thrilled. They didn't have any idea that it was different. Now, that's sort of a small daily life occupational challenge, but you can see how people might begin to identify a goal. And we do this ourselves all day, every day. Did I find my keys? Did I get the paper reviewed? Did I get to work on time? Did I get my kids on time? Have I scheduled? Every time we do this, whether the occupational challenge is small or large, we analyze our response to it. Were we effective? Were we efficient? And were we satisfied? So that's the basis for the RMS. So let's take a look at the study. That gives you some background information about occupational adaptation in the instrument. So the purpose of this study was to take the instrument itself, which is straightforward and simple, to assess its specific to assess its viability, whether it is reliable and valid, whether we could use it for education, research, for practice. And the specific aims were to look at the number of factors, to look at its unidimensionality, and to look at the order of item difficulty. And this is the article, this is the reference for it. So you'll have it to look at later. And if you would actually like to have it, just send me an email. I'll be happy to send it to you. Our method was to get as broad a variety of participants as we could. They needed to be English speaking. The instrument has not been translated into another language. So English speaking and of adult age. They were community dwelling adults. We did not ask about any disability status. So a normal population has some hitches there and there, but that was not the focus of what we were interested in. So just community dwelling adults. The instrument itself has 2 parts, and our focus was on those first 6 questions that you saw. The second part is an open-ended question, just asks, how did you do? And when people give responses, as in, I didn't get to the store, I had to modify and I had to adapt. In that part 2, that's the opportunity for an occupational therapist to ask participants to generate strategies about how to change and grow, how to adapt going forward. We didn't look at the part 2. We only wanted to look at part 1 with those 6 items to check their validity and reliability. The study was IRB approved, and the initial personal recruitment just started to snowball. One person heard about it and then posted it online or told a friend about it. So it just went on and on and on. And that was fine with us. So snowball is a good way to collect people. All the data were de-identified. They were entered into Excel, and then the data were moved to SPSS for analysis. We used both traditional analysis, classical test theory, and RASH analysis because we wanted to get a more comprehensive view of the psychometric properties of the RMS. So you see those listed here. And in our results, we had 368 participants, which was more than the minimum we needed to have. You see the number here who did report gender. We had a few who did not report gender. There were 14 who were non-reported. 290 were female and 64 were male. The ages ranged from 18 all the way to 95. Again, we had 7 who did not report age. Now, we'll go ahead and talk through the results. And I will preface this with telling you, using these different kinds of analytic measures has been a stretch goal for me professionally for many years. So it takes me quite a bit of effort and energy to take a look at those specific statistics and articulate why did we choose these and what did they tell us. So I have to be fairly deliberate in my discussion and in my description. And when those of you who are very articulate in research ask me questions afterwards, I will have to pause and say, wait a minute, why did we do this and what did it say? And I've collapsed the data analysis methods in with the results to help have this make more sense for a broader audience. So what this page tells you is we started out looking at correlation, and that the correlation was just going to tell us about a relationship between 2 variables. And if you have two variables that are too highly correlated, then you end up with multicollinearity, and you need to get rid of them. If they're too close, then you don't have good internal reliability with your measure. So you need to either remove them or collapse them or something else. So our Spearman correlation showed that that the items were significant. I'm looking at 2 screens here to be able to report what I'm seeing. Okay. We did not have items that were too highly correlated. We did not have any multicollinearity. We also did a Cronbach's alpha that gave us a 0.7 or higher. And that showed that we had good internal consistency reliability. And that's how well a test or a survey actually measures what you intend for it to measure. Sure, Cronbach's was very high. We're happy with that. Okay. Next we'll talk about is some more of the traditional analysis. And we plan to do exploratory factor analysis rather than confirmatory. We didn't want to come in with a hypothesis that says we already believe we have one factor. We wanted the numbers to prove that. So to start with, we did a Mahalanobis plot, and that's a very robust regression line where you take all of the data points and put them on a regression line, and it did reveal that we do have one factor. And at that point, we did a Kaiser criterion, and that statistical analysis runs vector lines to show you if there's any variance in the data. And if you have to be a certain distance from that vector line, but not too far. They're only values that are greater than 1 are worth looking at. If those eigenvalues are too close, then they're too close to the main set of the data, and you don't want to look at them. They're not giving you any information. The more factors that load on a particular component that have high correlation, the more important the factor is. There are certain levels for the factor loadings that need to be a plus or minus a 0.4. And we had, the more stringent cutoff was a plus or minus 0.7, and we were at a 0.71. So our factor loadings or principal components. Let's see. Reading two screens here, sorry. Okay, we did have values worth looking at. All 6 of the RMS items did load at a greater than 0.71. Okay. Right. This figure, no, I'm jumping screens again. Hold on, let me go back. That's the one I want. There's our melanobus. There's the RASH analysis. That's the one I want next. I am not a RASH analyst, I will tell you. In my layman's description of RASH analysis is that it is a complex mathematical modeling that shows the probability of an individual getting a response correct on a test item. The RASH analysis is an additive process so that you measure a person's latent trait with the item difficulty. And the latent trait can be something like an attitude or an ability. So you look at attitude and ability, and then you look at item difficulty, and it gives you a score. That's what I can tell you about RASH. The third person who joined us in this study about a year ago is an occupational therapist who has expertise in RASH analysis. She's the person who did the SPSS analysis for us and has done a lot of teaching for me to be able to talk at least a little bit about the statistics. So our RASH analysis did have an item separation that was a 0.97 and a person separation. Okay. One of the things, okay, I have to pause here. One of the things that the RASH analysis will tell us is that if there is an item that is outside of a narrow window, the item is misfit, and you need to get rid of that item on the scale. In the original relative mastery measurement scale, there were a couple of misfitting items. And when we revised the scale, what you see here is now 6 items. The original scale was 12. And we reduced it to 6, and we had no items that misfit, which tells us that we have a robust and reliable and internally consistent scale that we're able to assess a trait of attitude and a trait of ability to test well in the RMMS. There we go. This set of results is not one that we anticipated looking at, but showed up in the statistics. And there were 3 items or 3 questions that scored in the extreme category on high negative score or high positive score. And on this instrument that you looked at early on, our scoring shows that negative relative mastery is a negative number. If people are very dissatisfied or did not feel effective or efficient, they end up scoring a negative number. And if they feel very efficient, very satisfied, it's a positive number. So that's what the scores relate to here. And you can see the scale that's along the left-hand side. We had fewer than 10 respondents in those very extreme categories. People tended to score in the middle of the scale. And in this analysis, this is a person separation index. And what the person separation index shows us when we plotted all these respondents is that it looks like respondents tend to be in 3 different levels of relative mastery. It wasn't an aim for the study. We weren't intending to look at that, but it looks like there's some groupings of people who tend to have a negative relative mastery that haven't done what they set out to do and could benefit from some occupational therapy perhaps, and a group of folks in the middle that are fairly typical of, gosh, I'm not satisfied with these, but some of these behaviors work out pretty well. So they're in the middle. And then some folks on the far end that are pretty adaptive people, and they came up with strategies and had a sense of effectiveness and efficiency and probably had pretty high overall relative mastery scores. So we didn't anticipate looking at this person separation or differentiating people into different groups. And we think this is something that we'll look at going forward for a next study. Now, the short answer with my sort of stumbling through research questions is that in our Spearman's correlation, that was statistically significant at a 0.01. Means we don't have overlapping items, that they are indeed distinct items. There is none that we need to throw out. We had strong internal consistency, good reliability of this instrument within itself. We have one factor in our exploratory factor analysis. And in the RASH analysis, we're showing unidimensionality. There's nothing, again, there's no item that is an outlier that we need to get rid of. The items contribute to this single factor. A couple of more items in our discussion. We have internal consistency. We have high correlation with items that are not duplicative. There we go. So a summary for what this study gave us is that the instrument has sound psychometric characteristics. It is a valid and a reliable measure of the construct of relative mastery. And it does support application to monitor changes in adaptation across a variety of individuals. Our next plan, our plans going forward, are to look at this person separation to see if there are distinct characteristics or distinct pools of people in the way that they adapt in their relative mastery. We hope to translate it into some different languages. We hope to use it across age ranges and across disabilities, because it could be used for an individual sense of relative mastery, but it also could be used for quality improvement. When it's used for an individual, that person chooses their goal. They may say, I want to serve the cake for my meal that I had intended to serve. It could be, I want to be able to dress by myself. It could be, I want to improve my golf swing. It could be that I want to get a driving license. So whatever that person's goal is what's identified on the relative mastery scale. And then they rate their sense as they go forward. It also could be used for quality improvement. I've used it in higher education with health professions students. And in that instance, I was interested in doing program evaluation. So I provided with the students as a goal that they were successful in a particular assignment or successful in standardized patient clinical examinations. And I wanted to find out if the way that I was running the clinical examination or the way that I was running the assignment was meeting the goal. Did students have a sense of success? And was the instrument sensitive to change over time? So those are some of the other pieces we can use for individuals. We know, because that's what this study looked at. We haven't had a lot of studies that used it for quality improvement or for program evaluation. So that's also next on our list. Some of the current applications, ways that it's being used right now. It's being used by caregivers of persons who have dementia, caregivers of persons who have multiple sclerosis. It has been used in youth corrections, and I have an example I can show you. It's been used with community dwelling adults who have fitness goals, and they're identifying their individual goal. They may want, it may be weight loss, it may be being able to run a mile, it may be lifting a certain amount of weight, like that. It has been used in program evaluation for higher education. I mentioned that one. It's just been used in a study looking at allied health profession students in OTPT and speech in their transition during that first semester in graduate school to see what their sense of mastery is. And it has just been used for a feasibility study to see if an onboarding program for new allied health professionals, professional faculty, have a sense of relative mastery. So it's out there and it's currently being used. Let me show you an example. This one I want to show you is a mentoring program that was used for youth who have been adjudicated to drug court. And there were several youth involved in this program. The youth were receiving services from OTD students in the community to help the youth set a goal. And in this instance, the youth was able to set a goal and said, I want to get a job, but didn't write any strategies for how they were going to accomplish that. The only strategies that they wrote pertain to a second goal about getting a driving license. So when you look at the RMS score here, you can see that it rises a bit and then it drops off. So in the end, they did not have a sense of relative mastery, didn't do well. And we think largely because they didn't identify strategies for adaptation to move forward. This individual had identified a goal of not wanting to get so angry. And you can see specific strategies that they wrote. When you compare their relative mastery score, you can see that it increases over time. The total score, the overall score, is what's reported here. When the youth were doing this with their OTD student mentor, they did it by hand, and they were able to compare the subscores. The relative mastery scale has 2 items that address effectiveness, 2 items that address efficiency, and 2 items that address satisfaction. So you see the subscores across the top. And then when you put them together, you see the total score at the bottom. The drug court was very happy with this process, and they asked if the program would be continued and if all the youth in corrections could be assigned to have OTD students working with them. That is all I have for you for my presentation. There are a few references that are here on the end. And this is how you find me if you would like to send me an email. And I will stop sharing now and we'll pause for questions that people have. There we go.
I see some clapping emojis. So thank you for your presentation, Nancy. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you just want to unmute yourself and ask questions.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Just curious. So when you administer that survey, I guess one thing I was concerned about is like bias underneath it. Is that RASH or was that analysis called? Does that kind of account for that? Some sort of sampling bias or the bias that participants might have when they enter a study like that?
A bias in terms of?
Like they come with their own biases, like how they, like their own cultural systems or belief systems, that type of bias.
They do indeed. And we have not yet divided people into categories for that kind of cultural bias. Would be an excellent question for the future, is do different groups of people or people of different age ranges or different spiritual backgrounds or different ethnicity, do they respond differently? Right now, we don't have the answer to that. And we did not ask people to identify those kinds of demographics for this pilot. They were just people.
The term for that, Nancy, just for your notes, is differential item functioning. It's exactly what you just said. I was just giving you the actual term.
Thank you.
Teresa?
Yeah, I had a question. You talked about monitoring. Thank you, by the way. Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. Monitoring the progress of an individual's adaptation, occupational adaptation. Is there a time frame that you've identified in some of these studies that does it take a period of time for that to happen, or can it be a couple of exposures and practice in the event that's been identified, the goal, or does time matter?
Good question, Teresa. It will vary dependent on the goal. And it depends on whether the person is working on this task independently or whether they're involved in occupational therapy. So the outside direction makes a difference. And I can give you an example. When I've done this study with students who were working on a simulated patient competence exam, I would ask them to complete the RMS before they had an opportunity to practice in class, before they were introduced to their space case, and learn more about what it was like and learn how to do some improv tasks and who would be their cases, what their roles would be in practice. After they had the practice session, I asked them to rate themselves again. And then after they had their actual space case, their simulated competency exam, I had them rate themselves again. And that was time compressed by about 2.5 weeks based on the information that I was giving them. If the goal was something like the youth who wanted to get his driving license, that's a bit more spread out because it takes time to have the written test and then takes time to practice the driving and then another assessment after they've taken the driving exam. So it would be goal dependent.
I have a question. You showed different applications in use of the questionnaire, but I was really curious because you used it for caregivers in 2 instances. And I wondered if you had any plans to use it for patient care / rehab. I noticed
Yes.
MS patients. Yeah. Can you
Yes,
speak to that?
yes, we do. The rationale behind having the caregivers respond was because in the case of the population with dementia, they're not able to understand the questions. So the relative mastery, the adaptation is happening on the part of the caregiver rather than the individual. But yes, one of the initial pilots for the earlier instrument for the RMMS was done with patients in rehabilitation settings. We actually like to take it to the ACRM conference, but haven't submitted that proposal yet in my spare time.
Nancy, thank you for your presentation today. I had a question about, kind of to CJ's point about people's sort of biases and differential item function. I was curious if you think it would be a good strategy to examine the RMS scores and their, variation with external raters scoring of that individual to see, are people accurate when they say, oh, I think other people would be satisfied with my performance. And then maybe you could have some external measure like an exam score for the space case, or if you used it, on fieldwork, you could use a fieldwork rating or something like that. Do you think that would be a useful strategy?
Possibly, except that a fieldwork performance score or a score given by a faculty rater on the simulated patient performance is usually one of skill and not mastery. And they're definitely not the same. Another example can be, I'll give you another one. I told you about a cake baking, but another example would be sometimes you learn more from things that go poorly than from things that go well. And there could be a student who is involved in a SPACE case, a simulated patient clinical exam, and it just turns out terribly. They forget to do some things that were essential skills or essential tasks in their evaluation, or they burst into tears, or the patient does, and it is just a horrendous flop. And the score that the student has received from the instructor is very low. They did not master the skill. But when the student goes away, after they've had their debrief, the student goes away and they would rate themselves on a relative mastery scale. And it might say something like, I will never do that again in my entire life. I will never make that mistake. And I learned so much that I have this sense of relative mastery, even though the skill, the performance was terrible. And that's part of the intent behind the relative mastery scale.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any additional questions. One last call for questions. Well, Nancy, what an excellent presentation with a broad base of application. I really appreciate you taking your time to share your research with us.
Thanks all so much, and your patience with me as I continue my professional stretch goal to be articulate, not so articulate, to learn about how the statistical analysis relate to what we want them to say. Thanks so much.
We work in teams. So
that's why we work in teams.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you all.